Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and welcome back to Meta Monday, the weekly series where we analyze the Pokemon TCG Pocket metagame and keep you guys up to date on everything that's going on in the competitive world of Pokemon TCG Pocket. So, this is the first meta report of this new format since Celestial Guardians came out. This is the Ursa Days Pocket Weekly number 27. Over 1,000 people competed in the first large online tournament of this new format. The information in this video is going to be absolutely ridiculous. We have so much to talk about. So many great new deck lists and a lot of information that I think is going to be really relevant for people who are preparing to compete in tournaments in the upcoming week, but also taking this information and taking it over to ranked battles. I think that there's a lot of information that translates between the two. So let's dive into it, guys. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Stay tuned for future updates and information and videos and deck lists that we cover here on the channel. I think that this is going to be a great place to go in the upcoming weeks to stay up to date. Tomorrow is also going to be our official first tier list of the new format, so you guys are going to want to stick around for that for sure. But anyway, let's get right into it. So here are the standings. We're going to lead off with the standings here. We're going to go over the top placing deck lists, and then we're going to go over into the metagame tab and take a look at the meta shares and the win rates after we go through sort of the standings. So this is it. Now, it's going to be fairly surprising to you guys maybe to see what kind of decks made it to the top of this tournament and did so well. At the number one list here, we actually have Giratina EX with Snorlax. At number 2, we have Magnezone with Oricorio. At number 3, we do have Incineroar with Charizard. And at number 4, we actually have Greninja and Giratina, which is actually playing Oricorio. We'll take a look at it. We have Giratina Darkrai, standard Giratina Darkrai, another Darkrai, or not Darkrai, Giratina and Snorlax deck, more Darktina, and then we actually have a Garchomp Rampardos deck here in 8th place. And then if we go down, more Fire, more Greninja Darkrai, and then a bunch of Giratina and Darkrai. So Giratina, still probably the deck, or I guess the card that is probably the most influential card in Pokemon Pocket. Let's dive right into the deck lists, and we'll start talking about some of these new decks and why I think they did well, and what about them is really, really good. So here's the number one deck of the tournament, the number one first placing deck list, and this player was playing Giratina with Snorlax, the Collapse Berry Snorlax, and then with Greninja, just 2 Froakie, 2 Greninja, and 2 Rare Candy. So the whole idea with this deck list is that the combination of Greninja and Giratina is actually really potent right now. Basically, you can actually bring this 130 damage with Giratina up to 150 with a Greninja ping. We can also pair it with Cyrus, give us some flexibility in targeting a bench Pokemon, and this combination is really, really, really strong. Now, you might be wondering, what type of energies are we playing with this deck? Well, since Snorlax is a colorless Pokemon, we are typically, I think, playing both water energies and psychic energies. That way, we can ramp up Giratina, we can double up on Giratina and potentially attack on turn 3. If we do at least get 1 psychic energy in our energy zone, but we also, those water energies can use to attach to Greninja if we need to attack with it. Greninja is actually a really strong attacking option. Sometimes you lead Froakie and you do get the Rare Candy Greninja up on turn 2. And that way, if we're going second, we could actually just Water Shuriken, Mist Slash, and KO maybe an active Pokemon. But the main leadoff for this deck is Snorlax. And we're pairing Snorlax with Greninja and Giratina because it all synergizes really, really well. So the whole idea with this deck list is that Snorlax should be our leadoff option. It's got 140 HP, which is actually really, really relevant. We can attach a Rocky Helmet to it, potentially live most hits by, most Pokemon in the game. And it's basically a wall specifically for things like Oricorio, which is very, very common. But Snorlax can just hit through Oricorio really consistently. It can soak up a ton of damage. We're playing 2 Pokemon Centers Ladies, which kind of pair really well with Snorlax with its high HP, but also the fact that it puts itself to sleep. So Pokemon Center Lady, just really, really good. It's probably one of the best healing cards in the game. With the status change, there's also a lot of like Poison Barbs and Poison going around in the format too. But anyway, Snorlax is the lead. So the idea here is that we're going to take a couple turns, attach a couple energies to Snorlax while using Broken Space Bellow to set up our Giratina at the same time on the bench. So our energies typically are being split between Snorlax and Giratina, and then by turn 2 or turn 3, if we do have Berry, we can attack with Snorlax, maybe get some damage or KO off on an active Pokemon, all the while hopefully evolving up into Greninja to give our deck a lot of flexibility. So the deck is actually really consistent. It flows really, really well. No matter which Pokemon you start off with, there are some pretty consistent lines that allow you to basically beat any deck in the game. Snorlax with 140 is just really relevant. We just live a lot of different hits from a lot of different Pokemon, and being able to attack for 100 damage on turn 2 is exceedingly strong. And even if we are going first and we can't get this attack off until turn 3, that means that we should be able to get an extra energy on Giratina, and it's really not that bad. So if we are leading with Snorlax, we can kind of be really either like really fast-paced and explosive, maybe get a Greninja out early, or we can take our time, soak up some damage with Snorlax, and get our Giratina set up. So this is a really, really good deck against, again, like I said, all of the Oricorio decks, but the combination of Giratina and Greninja gives us a lot of flexibility against matchups that even aren't Oricorio. So it's a really fun list on the in-between, basically playing really into the fact that Oricorio is likely going to be pretty popular in a variety of different deck lists, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. Snorlax is really just a really great counter to Oricorio, especially with Pokemon Center Lady and Rocky Helmet. And then Giratina Greninja is just a combination that's really volatile, but again, two Pokemon that are really, really good and don't have to be in the active spot to really do anything. They can kind of sit back. Giratina can set up energies while Greninja just sort of pings damage. Really, really strong combination here, and a lot of synergy between this deck list. It's actually a lot more consistent than you would think. Again, we don't have to get Berry on our first turn. Most of the time, we really want Berry by our second or third turn, which means that it's actually a lot more consistent than you might think. And then again, just more time to set up Giratina. So this list flows really, really well. It got first place mainly, I think, the reason why this deck got first place in the tournament primarily is because it hit probably several Oricorios, one of them being this player here who got second place in finals. He hit a Magnezone and Oricorio deck, which again, Snorlax and Greninja and Giratina counters pretty heavily. So that's sort of the main, I guess, sort of talking point around Snorlax, is that it's really good against Oricorio. So in a format where Oricorio is really, really common, it kind of does seem like we're kind of splitting the format down the middle. Like, that's kind of what Oricorio seems to do. You're either playing Oricorio decks or you're playing the decks that are, of course, not Oricorio, which probably struggle against Oricorio, right? That's what we saw a lot of times early on the format. You could play things like Solgaleo, which again, we haven't seen much here. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Or you could play Charizard or Incineroar or Giratina Darkrai. These are all decks that are really strong, but again, they struggle with Oricorio. So you're either playing those decks, which are good, and then losing to Oricorio, or you're playing Oricorio, which is bad against a lot of the other decks, like Rampardos or Meowscarada or the grass decks or anything like that. But you're really good against those decks, so it seems like the format is split down the middle. But what Snorlax does is it kind of walks that middle line, where you're actually pretty good against the decks that even aren't Oricorio, but you have also a really good matchup against Oricorio. So I think that's where Snorlax really kind of fit in. This player here, we can actually take a look at his matchups here, and we can see, actually, we got to go into the player, not the deck here. So if we take a look at this guy right here and we take a look at his matches, he actually played against a lot of different decks, but one thing you'll notice here is that he did hit quite a few of different Oricorios, right? So this Greninja deck was Oricorio, this Magnezone deck was Oricorio, and I believe he hit probably Oricorio down here as well. So his only loss was actually 2 fighting, and he did tie against another Giratina deck with Magnezone. So he beat a lot of different decks here to get to the grand finals. He beat Grass, he beat Arceus Crobat, beat Giratina Darkrai, beat Garchomp, and then beat Greninja Giratina with Oricorio, and then Oricorio Magnezone. So that's the cool thing about Snorlax. Very, very good matchups into Oricorio. However, it's actually pretty decent against the decks that aren't Oricorio. So it's a really nice middle ground. Kind of one of the only few decks right now, other than maybe the fighting decks, that seemingly have good matchups against both the Oricorio decks and non-Oricorio decks. I say good matchups, but not terrible matchups. Okay, so the second place list is probably the most common way that we're going to see people play Oricorio, at least at this point in time. And this is just the standard, a fully Electric-type Magnezone and Oricorio deck. And it is pretty good. Again, against decks that don't really have a great answer to Oricorio specifically, Magnezone really kind of covers that slack. We're playing 2 Guzma predominantly for the scenarios where our opponent is playing maybe Rocky Helmet or Poison Barb, or if we're just going against Skarmory and Solgaleo, which did see a lot of play in this tournament. We just didn't see it placing super well for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about. But this Oricorio deck is good. I think the only difference between this deck and the only awkward part about it is that we're not playing a lot of healing. So in some scenarios, if we don't get Magnezone set up, Oricorio just sort of gets whittled down by either a Greninja ping or Darkrai's Nightmare Aura, or a variety of different scenarios, maybe even a burn from Incineroar, right? So we're not playing too much healing with this Oricorio list, which means we're pretty reliant on getting Magnezone set up. But Oricorio kind of does enough of its job. Half the time, though, you're not leading with Oricorio, so the deck does have its inconsistencies, but once we take a look at the win rates, you'll see that this Magnezone Oricorio deck actually had a really, really good win rate throughout the entire field, and I think that's important to note. Oricorio as a card is really impactful. It kind of found its way into, I believe, 2 of the top 4 decks, but a lot of the top decks of this tournament. Again, I just don't think a lot of people are actually counterplaying for Oricorio. I think a lot of people just said, you know what, whatever, I'm just going to play the decks that are new, that I think are really strong, and I'm going to hope for the best. But Oricorio did sort of find its way all the way up through, unfortunately losing to Snorlax in the finals, which, like I said, was that perfect middle ground. But anyway, yeah, this is Oricorio with Magnezone. Fully electric, so you have the advantage of, not needing to get a bunch of extra energies on Magnezone to attack. If you do get Magnezone out on turn 3, then you can attack on turn 3. We're not playing Rare Candy because we are a little bit reliant on Magneton, which does make the deck a bit slower, meaning that, at the very least, we're not actually able to attack with Magnezone until turn 3, and that's at the very earliest. However, we are going to just absolutely lose to any fighting deck, so keep that in mind. Oricorio is popular. Fighting is another really good option, but I think the interesting thing about Oricorio is that, again, a lot of the decks that people played in this tournament, in fact, I believe the 3 most played decks were all decks that just had poor matchups into Oricorio, and that's just the reality of it. I know you might be thinking like, oh, like, you know, my Incineroar deck can still beat Oricorio, my Giratina Darkrai deck can still beat Oricorio. That's certainly true, but in a tournament setting, if you have, you know, a 60-70% win rate by playing Oricorio, then you're more likely or not going to see it have some success. But okay, talking about non-sort of Oricorio for a moment here is going to be Charizard and Incineroar here at 3rd place. This was actually, I believe, the 2nd most played deck of the tournament. We'll take a look at that in a little bit, but this is basically the new version of like high roll sort of, you know, like kind of fire type decks. We're playing Stoke Charizard with Incineroar. We're actually just playing 2 Charizard and only 1 Incineroar. So predominantly a Charizard deck. The cool thing about this list, though, is that we can struggle a little bit against Oricorio, but the combination of like 2 different Charmeleons, or I guess we're only playing 1 Charmeleon, but if we have like Charmander, Charmeleon, and Incineroar, that's typically enough damage to at least handle with Oricorio directly. However, you know, Oricorio decks have other things in them, so that's the other thing that we struggle with, but this is a very, very strong deck list. Definitely a little bit RNG dependent. However, against some matchups, the double Lily combination with red as well, allowing Charizard to hit for 170, kind of just wins you a lot of games. And I think that Charizard isn't a terrible card, and I think that Incineroar is not a terrible card either. But again, if you look at the win rates for this tournament, it's not like fire-type decks like Charizard or Incineroar did that well, especially considering how many people played them. They actually kind of underperformed to a certain extent, but it's certainly not a bad deck list. Again, if everybody kind of swaps to Oricorio decks, you know, these decks are going to struggle. But the other upside too, and I think the big reason why Fire did really well in this particular tournament was because a lot of people, in fact, the most common deck of this tournament was Solgaleo. And of course, Solgaleo isn't a deck that's going to love playing against, you know, 2 Charizards and an Incineroar. Just not something that, you know, is going to help it very much. So Charizard and Incineroar kind of seeming to be kind of the default, I suppose, fire type deck right now, which certainly is good, but I don't think it's really as good as maybe a lot of people have assumed it to be. And again, because so many people were playing fire, Solgaleo definitely didn't do very well, which is why we actually don't even see a Solgaleo here in the top standings until all the way down here at 23rd place, and it was actually Solgaleo with Excavalier, and then we also have a couple down here. So there were some that made day 2. They just didn't make it very far here, not anywhere near sort of the top tables. But anyway, that's Charizard and Incineroar. We'll talk a little bit about how the decks interact next, but this next deck list is one that I actually just sort of recently made a video on, or this particular archetype, which is going to be the Greninja Giratina combo, except now we're actually pairing it with Oricorio. So very similar to Snorlax, if we're not playing Snorlax in Giratina and Greninja, then Oricorio is also a pretty good partner with it. This deck's a little bit different. We're playing Frogadier and 1 copy of Shaman. But I actually don't really think that the Shaman is that needed. It certainly can be good against certain matchups like Incineroar's Burn or even Giratina Darkrai with the damage pings going off. But the cool thing about this deck is we're playing not psychic energies, but we're playing water energy and electric energy, which allows us to, I believe so. We're definitely playing water, but I would definitely assume that we're playing electric energies and not water psychic in this deck. That way we can attack with Oricorio. But the cool thing about this deck list is that we're able to play Irida, which means that we can actually heal both our Greninja, Giratina, or Oricorio, or really anything at the same time with Irida, which is actually really, really nice. But this deck list is very similar. So again, if you wanted to play that Greninja and Giratina strategy, but instead of playing sort of counter to Oricorio, if you wanted to just play Oricorio, it actually fits extremely well into this same sort of archetype, that combination of Greninja and Giratina, for the same reasons. Oricorio is the leadoff instead of Snorlax, and instead of just being really good against Oricorio, we're good against all of those decks that, of course, aren't good against Oricorio. So again, we're on like the left side. Like if we split things down the middle, Snorlax is right in that middle there, that middle ground. And then on the left here are the Oricorio decks. This is a deck that's really, really strong, especially against anything that's weak to Oricorio. And then on the far right, we have things like Giratina Darkrai, like Incineroar, like Charizard, like Solgaleo, decks that really do struggle against Oricorio. So if you wanted to play Oricorio and you didn't want to play like the Magnezone strategy, if you didn't want to go like all in on it, then this is a really good deck list for you. Now, we're kind of splitting our differences a little bit. So we're playing Oricorio, but we're not like fully leaned into sort of the Oricorio strategy like we are with Magnezone. This gives us a lot more flexibility, meaning with Greninja and Giratina, we actually have a lot more of a better chance of winning matchups that aren't necessarily reliant on Oricorio. So I think that's certainly the upside to a deck list like this. There are scenarios where Oricorio is going to be absolutely useless to you, but that's fine because we have Giratina and we have Greninja. So it's interesting. I think you could change around this list quite a bit. The list that I made, or I guess played in my video yesterday, was not playing Shaman or Frogadier, and I was just playing 2 Giratinas, and I believe I was playing like an extra healing card in there as well. So I just sort of like compressed the deck list a little bit to make it a little bit more simple in its functionality. I do think that the Flagrant Flower, Garden, Shaman is fine, but I think that the combination of Iridas, like I think you could just cut the Shaman for like a Pokemon Center Lady, and it would be a little bit more versatile. I think for a lot of matchups, what you want is like 2 Oricorio, 1 Greninja, and 1 Giratina. That's typically the board state that you shoot for, but again, in scenarios where Oricorio isn't that useful, Shaman's going to provide more value. It just kind of makes the deck a little bit less consistent and limits your board space a little bit. But I really like this list, and like I said, it's basically, I think, the best way to play Oricorio if you want to at least not auto-lose against the decks that are, of course, really good against Oricorio, like Fighting, like Garchomp, like Rampardos, things like that. So again, another flavor of it, but this is a list that I think is really, really good. Again, it's a bit middling, but Oricorio just sort of auto-wins enough matchups anyway that when you pair it with things like Greninja and Giratina, you increase your odds to beat the decks that, of course, Oricorio is not necessarily helping you with, which I think is really, really important. And this deck list got 4th place. So that's the top 4 decks. Like we've got Oricorio Magnezone, we've got, and then 2 Greninja and Giratina decks, just one with Snorlax, one with Oricorio. So one thing to note though, and again, if we look at the standings, the overall standings, what you'll notice though is that realistically, Giratina is still the best deck in the game, or it's the best card in the game. I don't think there's really any way around that. I think that Giratina's consistency, its flexibility, it's a high amount of HP for a basic EX Pokemon, and it's just good enough. Like it's so good and flexible that it's going to find its way into deck lists that are also good. So one thing to note here is that I think a lot of people expected Giratina and Darkrai to fall off, and it probably will to some extent. It's still a deck I think that struggles against Oricorio. And isn't phenomenal against some of these Stage 2 decks, but at the same time, it's still really, really good. In fact, if we look at the win rates for this tournament, you'll see that Giratina Darkrai actually had perhaps one of the highest win rates of the tournament. But again, I think that it's probably better to just note that Giratina really is sort of the star of Pokemon Pocket, at least still currently. No real counterplay to it other than Oricorio, so people are, again, just pairing it with Oricorio or cards that directly counter Oricorio. So that's the whole idea with how I think the format has shaped up, which is a bit of a deviation. I think that I think originally people thought Oricorio wasn't going to be that impactful in terms of itself as a card, but I think it's flexible enough, and because Giratina and other cards pair with it so well, that I think it's just going to be impactful enough to really change the outcome of the metagame. I could be wrong about that, but Oricorio doing so well this week does tell me that it's probably going to see a lot of play. You're either playing Oricorio or a counter to Oricorio, or you're just hoping that you don't hit any of those decks and you just play something else. I guess that's really strong. But the main thing to note though, like if you're not playing any of the Oricorio decks, like you probably still want to play Giratina, because either Giratina Darkrai or Giratina with Snorlax are probably some of the better decks that aren't playing Oricorio, which again is not something that maybe people want to hear, but truthfully, Giratina is still the best card in the game, and I think that you're kind of doing yourself a disservice by not playing it. And I think some people are going to be a little bit disappointed by that. We'll talk about it more in our tier list tomorrow, but truthfully, yeah, Giratina is insane. Okay. Let's take a look at the top placing Giratina and Darkrai deck. Again, a deck that gets basically hard-walled by Oricorio, but is exceptionally good against basically everything else in the game. It's still, I think, the best overall deck. Its consistency, its damage output, and the flexibility playing so many of these cards here. We have 1 Mars, 1 red card. We still have the Rocky Helmet, the Giant Cape, Pokemon Center Ladies, Potions. We've got Cyrus, Sabrina, and even a red as well. So this deck has everything in it, just like it did last format, to basically do everything. We're not playing Guzma in this list. Guzma is really, really good, but at the same time, there's really just not much that, we can't deal with, so Guzma is not, like, that important. I think, realistically, the only things that beat Giratina Darkrai that aren't Oricorio might be Meowscarada, but Meowscaradas might struggle for sure, depending on how many people are playing Fire-type decks, which, again, this week there was a lot of Fire. But anyway, Giratina Darkrai, absolutely still phenomenal. Inherently, probably still the strongest deck in the game, but now at least we have a hard counter to it, which should knock it down a peg or two than it was last format, where we didn't just have like any hard counters to it. We had to just play Gyarados and then hope that we drew our cards, and that was really it. So yeah, that's sort of where we're at with Giratina and Darkrai. Still extremely strong, but at least now with Oricorio, we have strategies that can just sort of beat this deck, which I think is actually really good. For the metagame at least. Okay, so after this Giratina Darkrai deck in 5th place, we have yet another Greninja deck, but this one's a little bit different, and this one is actually going to be with Tapu Lele. This way, we can still play the Water Psychic energies and then hit the bench for even more effect. So this gives us, again, a little bit more flexibility in our attacking options here. So we're not playing 2 Giratina, we're just playing 1 Tapu Lele. Everything else is very similar, and we are actually playing 1 Lima in the deck, which I actually do like. So there are scenarios where, Snorlax is your leadoff option, and you get your Greninja and your Giratina set up, but you just never draw your berry. and that can feel kind of bad. So in a scenario where maybe we just sort of commit all of our energies to Giratina to get this set up, we have at least an effective retreat option to get that Snorlax out of the active spot. So it gives you an extra route, right? In your opening hand, let's say you're still going to want to choose to lead Snorlax. So let's just say we're leading Snorlax, but in our opening hand, we don't have Berry, but we have Lima. Then we go, okay, we can just sort of commit a little bit more to the Giratina. That way we know we can just at least get out of the active with Snorlax and have a secondary attacking option. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility there. I do like this deck list. I don't know how good Tapu Lele is. It is a little bit kind of useless in the early game. However, with one Cyrus, it can also act as a bench attacking option, which is definitely pretty cool as well. And it kind of can fix some KOs. Like Greninja can do 20 damage to the bench, but Tapu Lele for 1 energy can do even more energy to the bench. So if you don't have Cyrus, it can even take a KO. So it's actually pretty useful, and I actually do like it in the deck list, but I don't know exactly how much it does for the deck's consistency. Again, it's not a Pokemon we really want early on. I think we would even still rather lead with Giratina so that we could just sort of maybe turn 3 attack with it. That's at least a better option than leading with Tapu Lele and just sort of doing nothing for a couple turns. But interesting nonetheless. Again, just another flavor of these Snorlax sort of Greninja decks. Like I said, good enough against everything that's not Oricorio, but very good against Oricorio. Puts the Snorlax decks in a very, very good position, other than maybe fighting, I think, is probably where we're going to struggle with Snorlax for sure. And also Giratina Darkrai. That's the other downside to playing Snorlax is like, if we're not playing like Oricorio, we're going to struggle against just the normal Giratina and Darkrai deck. So like Giratina Snorlax, much better against Oricorio, but a lot worse against Giratina Darkrai. So it's this really kind of strange balancing act here at the top of the metagame. And if we go down here, I'm actually just going to skip this 7th players list here, and we're going to take a look at Garchomp, because this is kind of a big surprise to me. I copied the deck list on accident. So Garchomp is actually really, really good. So this was the highest placing fighting type deck in the format, and interestingly enough, I think that Garchomp is actually something very much worth playing right now in the format for a variety of reasons. I think that with Rare Candy, the ability with Garchomp's linear attack to do 50 damage to a bench Pokemon is certainly still really relevant, and we also have the Rampardos line. So basically here, the idea is that Garchomp with a high amount of HP and the ability to basically pair it with a Pokemon with not a lot of energy in its attack cost means that we can just reliably always attach to our Gible, Gabite, and our Garchomp. And because we're fighting, we're actually really strong against Oricorio inherently, and we don't have to struggle against Oricorio at all because of Rampardos. And fighting, of course, is just in general fairly decent against Giratina Darkrai as well. And so is Rampardos. So it's a strong deck list, and against, again, some other sort of slower strategies, the Double Lily really does kind of protect you in a lot of ways. This is a deck that's, again, really good against the Snorlax Giratina deck. So it's definitely sort of a niche pick here. But I think that fighting type decks have really kind of found their spot in the metagame as, again, one of those sort of in-between decks. A deck that can kind of balance between being good against Oricorio and then having at least a decent, I guess, matchup chance against the decks that aren't Oricorio. So I like it. I think that right now you're either forced to playing either like a straight Oricorio deck, or you're forced to be playing, the non-Oricorio decks that are really strong, things like Incineroar, Charizard, and Giratina Darkrai, or you're in the middle. And if you're playing the middle, I think that really your only options are Snorlax with Giratina, or also some of these fighting decks. And I think that Garchomp is a really good option there. Again, really good against Snorlax, which is pretty important as well. I like this list. I really do. I mean, again, you can linear attack on your second turn going first. That's really, really strong. It's just enough. Like, Garchomp is good enough. I think right now in the format to where fighting is well positioned enough as well, it just sort of works out. And I really do think that Garchomp is probably a lot better than people give it credit for. Again, massively buffed by Rare Candy and Lily, but I think that's a big enough upside. Again, with Cyrus as well, pairs really nicely with the bench damage. It's just a good deck. It really is. I don't know if it's going to end up being the best Rampardos deck. I think for this tournament it placed the highest, but if we go down, we would probably find some Lycanroc Rampardos decks, or even some Lucario Rampardos right here. So there's Lycanroc Rampardos here at 33rd place. And if we go down a little bit, there's actually a Gallade here, which is funny. But anyway, yeah, that's Garchomp was actually by far the most successful fighting deck of this tournament, but it could have very well been really any other, fighting type deck list, right? It kind of fell that way this week at least. Okay. And that's really kind of it for the top decks. What we can do if we go down a little bit, these are two Arceus and Crobat decks, which are actually really relevant, and they actually did really well in day one. I think they just sort of lost early in day two, but definitely had really good runs. Again, 9-1 is really impressive. And there's two different types, but this is basically Cunning Link and Power Link Carnivine with Arceus. So we're playing Grass Energies in this deck, definitely. Zubat here with Colorless Energies means we can attack with it, but with no Dark Energies being played, we can't attack with Crobat. And you would want to play Grass and Dark because I don't think you would much rather get that early Carnivine damage off consistently than have the option to attack with Crobat later on. But this is a really, really good deck. Again, it kind of is very, very similar to like the Giratina, Greninja, and like Snorlax deck, where you have like, so your backline setup Pokemon, you have your bench stage 2 support Pokemon that can deal extra damage, and you have your sort of aggressive leadoff option. And that's what Carnivine is in this deck list. So I don't know exactly how good Arceus is. It's a deck that's going to struggle against the fighting type decks, but if you do get everything sort of wrapped up nicely, if you lead with Carnivine, you bench Arceus, and you can evolve into Crobat, there's a lot that you can do, and the deck is exceedingly powerful. Crobat as well, or not Crobat, but Carnivine is really good, really strong, and aggressive. And again, if we do find that Crobat, we can basically have Carnivine in the active, Arceus on the bench, and then Crobat on the bench doing damage. And that is, of course, 80 damage between Carnivine and Crobat, and that can all potentially come out on your second turn. So you got to keep that in mind. Very, very strong upside to this deck list. Maybe a little bit awkward if you do lead with Arceus. That's certainly not that good. And if we don't find our Crobats, then we're kind of a sitting duck in a lot of matchups as well. So this is a deck list that should not be slept on. This combination here, I think that Arceus and Crobat specifically has been buffed pretty heavily by Rare Candy, so it's something that we should definitely keep our eye on. I don't know if people are going to choose to play this combo more than some of the other combinations, but I do think that it is certainly worth keeping an eye on because it's just a really, really strong combination. And if we look at the other Arceus Crobat deck, it's going to be a little bit different. So this is actually being paired with Oricorio, Giratina, and Darkrai. So it's kind of this like weird kind of Arceus Crobat toolbox deck with Oricorio, and I actually like it. I think that you could honestly cut the Darkrai and you could cut Giratina, and you could actually just play a Lightning Energy in this deck, and you could just kind of play an Oricorio Arceus Crobat deck and maybe play some healing and cut some of these sort of additional cards. This deck is a little bit all over the place, but again, kind of carried again either by the combination of Crobat and Arceus and Darkrai, or also Oricorio. It's just sort of thrown in there. This is what we might see in a lot of deck lists, is people just throwing Oricorio in your deck because it can just act as a stall wall and just allow you to set up. So there might be like a metagame where you just play like an inherently strong setup deck, and then you just throw one Oricorio in there so you can just kind of leave it in the active and then just really increase your odds against some specific matchup. So that's another way to play this deck. And yeah, one Giratina I think is also pretty funny here as well. But you know, it's somewhat relevant. Like, again, if Arceus is on the bench and we're pinging with Crobat, Giratin's in the active, and we're attaching to Darkrai, that's a lot of damage. That's literally like 50 damage per turn, plus the damage they take from attacking Giratina. This is just a really, really funny strategy. Definitely awkward, because there's a lot of Pokemon we can lead with. You could lead with Arceus, you could lead with Darkrai, you could lead into Zubat and not evolve into Crobat. So it's just definitely a little bit awkward, but again, very, very strong in its late game potential when it does get set up. So a bit of a sort of a luck-based high roll deck. It did go 8-2 though. Certainly very, very impressive. I actually want to take a look here. If we go down, there's another Greninja deck. And this one is a little bit more in line sort of with what I made the video on the other day, which is just not, it's not playing Shaman, it's not playing like Frogadier, we're just playing like the 2 Froakie, 2 Greninja, 2 Oricorio, and then just 1 Giratina. And I actually really like this deck list. Again, it allows us to play some more options. We can play a second Cyrus with this Greninja, which is certainly very, very good. And then only 1 Irida here, but you could cut the Iono or even the Guzma and play like another Irida or a Pokemon Center Lady. And I think it gives the deck enough staying power against the you know, the Incineroars, or I suppose the you know, the Darkrai decks that can kind of whittle down your Oricorios, but really good. So I actually, even though this deck didn't place as well as the other one, I actually like this version of Greninja, Oricorio, and Giratina a little bit better. It's just a little bit more streamlined, and I think that the deck benefits a lot from having that second Cyrus and maybe some more healing cards as well. So I really like this list, and in general, I think that this deck here is absolutely insane. Just for the reason that Oricorio is going to win you games, but also Greninja and Giratina can win you games against really anything in the game. So you kind of are just sort of beating everything if everything goes well for you, which I think puts this deck in an incredible position. Again, you're going to struggle a little bit against the Snorlax decks for sure. That's not going to be a winning matchup, but at least you have the ability to beat that deck list, right? You're not automatically losing to anything because we have Greninja, Giratina, which I think is certainly really important to note. Okay, and if we go down just a little bit, we're going to find something also pretty funny, which is just another flavor of Greninja and Oricorio. However, instead of playing Giratina, we are actually playing the comforting song Wigglytuff. So Wigglytuff can act as an attacking option with this deck list. We're not using Giratina, we're playing only stage or non-EX Pokemon, which is pretty funny. Yeah, so you can attack with Wigglytuff, but really it's here to keep that Oricorio alive in those matchups. And then Greninja is sort of that backline, you know, attacking option to Oricorio. So it's certainly not a bad strategy whatsoever. Again, very much sort of leading into the Oricorio here. Less of, I guess, flexibility in your matchups that aren't weak to Oricorio, but Wigglytuff with Greninja, I mean, these are Pokemon that can do enough to win you games. So Pretty cool. And again, the one thing you got to keep in mind about these Greninja decks is like sometimes you do lead Froakie and just go turn 2 Greninja 80 damage, and then you're kind of just rolling. Like, I mean, you have 120 HP. That's 140 with Giant Cape. We're doing 80 damage every turn with Greninja. It's actually a pretty good Pokemon if it just gets online early enough, which I think is certainly pretty cool. And if we go down here, let's take a look at some of these Solgaleo decks, because no, they didn't place very well in the tournament, but I think there's specifically a reason for that. The highest placing Solgaleo deck was actually with Excavalier, which is really funny because this is a pretty decent like leadoff option to Solgaleo. It's a stage 1 Pokemon, so it's not a basic like Skarmory, but it doesn't rely on tool cards. And it actually has a pretty good attack, so it does 30 damage and then 20 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. Actually quite strong, especially with 2 Cyrus in the deck. Gives us a lot of flexibility to potentially target down and then bring up and KO a Pokemon on our opponent's bench that's being set up. So I actually really like it. I think it's pretty good, actually. But Solgaleo did kind of struggle a little bit. And then we'll take a look at a Skarmory Solgaleo deck, which here was a lot more standard, right? 1 Lily, 1 Red, 1 Sabrina, and then, 4 tool cards, and then we just have the old Skarmory Solgaleo combination. So this is definitely the more standard way people are playing Solgaleo, and I think it is a really, really strong deck, but I just think that it struggles against some specific things that, unfortunately, were pretty common in this week's, competitive setting. But, again, a lot of the data and the information that we get from a tournament, you have to look at it like a snapshot, right? So you take a look at all of the decks that saw play, which we'll take a look at right now, and then you kind of like just sort of make the inference that, okay, this week on this many games, these were the decks that saw play, and then this was the result. And typically that all kind of makes sense, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's like a large enough sample size to, I guess, adhere to like everything you might be seeing in like Master Ball rank or things like that, right? Where it's much more diverse in ranked battles. People are playing, at least right now in the format, people are playing basically everything. So I do think some of those in-between strong decks, like the Greninja Giratina decks, are probably your best pick in ranked battles, just because whether you're playing Snorlax or Oricorio, you can at least beat the matchups that aren't your strong matchups, right? You're good enough to beat those matchups. So I think that those are probably still the best decks in the game right now. But if you're not playing either of those Greninja and Giratina decks, you probably just want to play Giratina Darkrai because it is inherently the strongest deck in the game. Okay. Let's take a look here at the metagame, and again, this will give us a lot of useful information as it pertains to the results here. So, the most played deck this week was Solgaleo EX with Skarmory. It was about 12.5% of the meta share, but struggled pretty heavily at 47.5%. Again, a big reason for that is its matchups, and if we take a look here at its matchups, we can kind of see exactly why that was the case. So, Solgaleo and Skarmory, 50% against itself. That should be pretty obvious here. Pretty decent win rate, actually, against the Snorlax Giratina deck, but very, very bad win rate against Giratina and Darkrai, and also a losing matchup here against the Fire-type decks. And then again, we also actually were losing to Grass, which is pretty funny, but I do think that the Grass decks actually have a good matchup against you. And then also losing, if we go down here, we were losing to Oricorio pretty heavily. So yeah, I think that's sort of the main downside to Solgaleo and Skarmory, is that the format right now really isn't that kind to you. Enough people are playing Giratina and Darkrai, and Giratina Darkrai is probably the strongest sort of non-like EX or the strongest non-Oricorio deck. Which does sort of make it tough for some of these other decks to kind of fill in. But, what I am surprised by, and I will say this, is that, people played the new decks that they thought were strong. And I know it's the first week, so not everybody has all of the new cards, so that's going to skew the meta shares a little bit. But for the most played decks to be Solgaleo, Skarmory, and Charizard, and Incineroar, neither of these decks necessarily doing that good against Giratina Darkrai is really interesting to me, because Giratina Darkrai was the #1 deck of last format. So you would think that the most popular decks of this format would be decks that people would play that are good against Giratina Darkrai. That didn't really end up being the case for whatever the reason. People just wanted to play these new strong decks. But anyway, Charizard and Incineroar here, the second most played deck with a 9% meta share, had basically a 50% win rate, which again is not terrible, but certainly not as high as some of the other stuff that we're going to see. And again, like 91 people, only one of them made top 4, and then only another one made like top 16, and the rest of them didn't really come that close. So the performances of Charizard and Incineroar this week really wasn't that good. In fact, I honestly would not suspect this to be something that I would really choose to play, especially into a format right now where I think from here on out, Oricorio is going to be certainly a lot more common. Let's take a look at the matchups, though. We could get surprised by something in here. We actually see, so definitely a little bit of a winning win rate against Solgaleo and Skarmory. Actually, a tad bit of a win rate, actually, against Giratina Darkrai, 22 and 18 and 2, so a little bit above 50%, which is pretty strong, nothing super substantial, but really good win rates here against Snorlax Giratina and against Grass, of course, losing a bit to Rampardos, losing to Crobat and Arceus, but 0% win rate against Magnezone. and Oricorio. And then if we go down here, 1 in 5 as well against Greninja and Giratina. So again, I think that the matchups here, especially against the decks that are probably going to be a little bit more common, specifically Oricorio, kind of makes this deck list a little bit tough to play. So I think right now, it's actually pretty safe to assume this matchup, I mean, it's a small sample size, but this win rate here against Giratina or Darkrai does tell me that this deck is inherently strong enough to at least survive even with the bad Oricorio matchup. But again, it's definitely on the far right side of things where you're not countering Oricorio and you're not playing Oricorio, which means you definitely don't want to be playing against Oricorio to any capacity, right? Which is interesting because I think Oricorio is certainly going to see a little bit more play as time goes on. But yes, the third most played deck was Giratina and Darkrai at 7% Metashare and a whopping 57% win rate. This is very akin to what we saw last format. 265 wins to 177 losses with 21 ties as well does give Giratina and Darkrai a phenomenal win rate this week. In the matchups against this particular format, Giratina Darkrai does do pretty well. As we see, very good against Solgaleo, very good against the Giratina and Snorlax deck, good against Rampardos, good against Charizard, and good against Arceus. Really good against this Rampardos deck as well. Strong against Crobat, strong against really a lot of the best decks in the format, but probably not very good. Actually, decent win rate against Magnezone and Oricorio, which is kind of funny if we actually think about it. And then if we go down here, did we play, 0-5 against Greninja and Oricorio. So there you go. Again, the sample sizes are small, but again, that's why the results happened the way they did. And Giratina Darkrai, extremely well positioned in the format, but is probably going to have a bit of a struggle against sort of the new age or upgraded Oricorio decks. But ultimately, Giratina and Darkrai is still probably the best deck in the game and the strongest deck in the game. So we're going to have to do some sort of counterplay to it. And I think that we do have counterplay to it, and that is going to be Greninja, Giratina with Oricorio, right? So to be fair, I think that those are the best decks. So if you split the format into like 3 categories, right, where you have Oricorio decks, non-Oricorio decks, and then counter Oricorio decks, then Giratina finds its way into the best option for all 3, which is kind of funny, but again, really does illustrate how good Giratina is. Anyway, let's take a look at Giratina Snorlax here. Pretty closely behind here. 67 people played it, 6.5% Metashare with a 54% win rate. Definitely pretty respectable for a deck that, to be fair, is kind of built specifically against Oricorio. Let's take a look at the matchups real quick. We see that it's actually a losing matchup against 3 of the most played decks of this format, or of this tournament, I should say. Solgaleo, bad matchup, or at least a losing matchup. Charizard and Incineroar, bad matchup. And then against Darkrai Giratina, quite a bad matchup. In fact, the only upside matchups that we have when we're playing Snorlax realistically are against here Magnezone and Oricorio. We did fairly well against Grass this week. And then also if we go down, all the way down, can we find the Greninja matchup? Right here. It's just 1 in 1, so actually not a big sample size. But this is a list that I suppose probably should beat the Greninja Oricorio decks pretty handily as well. I don't know why they wouldn't. I mean, it's basically the same thing, except you're playing Snorlax to counter Oricorio. So we don't have the sample size for it, but yeah, this is a deck that should counter both of the Oricorio decks pretty effectively. So there you go. And that's it. Like I said, there's sort of 3 different categories right now of deck lists, and Giratina finding its way into probably the best option for all of them. The other sort of non-impressive things here, Decidueye doing pretty poorly. I think a big reason why it did badly was, again, a lot of fire and a lot of, Giratina Darkrai, things like that are probably fairly good against grass. And then let's take a look here. So Rampardos didn't do like that well. Both Lucario Rampardos and Lycanroc Rampardos definitely kind of struggled, at least overall. And we didn't actually see them place very well either, so that kind of does make sense. These are sort of weird in-between decks. I do think that the format is actually going to move in a way that's a little bit more kind to these fighting decks, but this first week certainly wasn't a great time to be playing them. Next week definitely could be a different story. Straight Charizard did pretty poorly as well, and then Straight Incineroar also did poorly. So one thing to note is that these 2 Pokemon, both Charizard and Incineroar being really strong Pokemon, are actually quite bad unless they're being sort of paired together to some degree, which is kind of funny if you think about it. But yeah, certainly something to take note of. Meowscarada and Serena, small sample size, but didn't do super well. And then this Aerodactyl and Rampardos deck is actually probably the highest, or did better than really any other fighting type deck, although none of them really went super far in the tournament. Let's take a look at the highest placing deck list here. And this is going to be, okay, so it's basically Lycanroc Rampardos, but we have Aerodactyl as well. So there it is. Pretty cool, I guess. Pretty interesting. But yeah, Rampardos is not bad. I don't know. I think it's going to get better. I just think this week it probably wasn't a great time to be playing it. Crabominal and Greninja on a small sample size did pretty good, 29 and 24. I actually think that really Greninja, all Greninja decks, Darkrai Greninja here as well, did doing well. To be fair, I just think that Darkrai and Greninja is good. Giratina and Lunala, 14 and 12. These sample sizes are too small for us to really take a look at, but one takeaway to have is that Greninja is just a really phenomenal card. Whether you're pairing it with Giratina and Snorlax, or Giratina or Oricorio, or with Darkrai to some capacity, or even Crabominable, I do think Greninja is probably one of the stronger decks in the game here. And then Garchomp Rampardos, again, small sample size, about a 50%, but it did place pretty high. They had that one player that went pretty far. And anyway, there it is. That's sort of the results from this week, and yeah, definitely interesting. I think the meta share is pretty standard to me. I would expect to see, Solgaleo, Charizard, and Incineroar to be the most common decks because, they're kind of the new decks that everybody thought would be really strong. And of course they are strong, but positioning in the format and their matchup spreads is certainly something that is important to take a look at. One thing that I also expected was for Oricorio to do really well, but what I was surprised by was the massive lack in people actually playing Oricorio, right? If you look at here, only 22 people were playing Magnezone and Oricorio, and it made finals. And if we go all the way down here to Greninja and Giratina, which is all the way down here, only 4 people playing it, we had 2 of these decks actually make it in. Look at this win rate, by the way. Only 4 decks, but 26, 8, and 3, a 70% win rate. This was probably the highest win rate deck of the tournament, and only 4 people played it. So this was like the most significant meta call. And again, I did make a video on this yesterday if you wanted to learn more about it. But this deck here, I think, is probably the best position deck. Again, being an Oricorio deck, a hard counter to the decks that Oricorio were good against, but also good enough in the matchups that, of course, aren't even weak to Oricorio. So it's a really nice sort of middle ground. Massive showing, though, for this deck list. I mean, this is the big standout. Even, again, it's a small sample size, but only 4 people playing it, and 2 of them made it basically all the way to the end of the tournament is really, really strong. 26, 8, and 3, 70.5% win rate is absolutely ridiculous. So there you go. That's basically it. That's the tournament. So again, in summary, I think that Oricorio is going to have a massive impact on the metagame, but not in the way that I think some people think. And I think there are clear counterplays to Oricorio, but what it's going to do is, again, split the decks into really 3 categories. I've said this multiple times in this video, but you're either playing Oricorio, you're playing the decks that aren't Oricorio, or you're playing decks that are in the middle that aren't Oricorio but counter Oricorio, right? So you're kind of in the middle, and I think that there's some really strong decks on either sides of this sort of diagram here. I'm moving my hands around a lot. I don't know exactly what I'm doing, but truthfully, I think that Giratina, still, that's another big takeaway. Giratina, probably still the best deck in the game, or best card in the game by a wide margin. A lot of different partners in which we can fit Giratina into because it's such a flexible card and it's just such a good card. It can kind of fit in a lot of different places, but Oricorio definitely really good and Greninja really good as well. So I think a lot of the best decks of this format are going to be some iterations of Oricorio, Giratina and Greninja. Those are just really, really strong cards. And maybe Solgaleo and Charizard will stick around for a bit. Meowscarada and Decidueye as well has definitely a chance to do pretty well, because if Fire goes down in play, then Grass could definitely have a lot more of a chance. But truthfully, that's sort of it. That's sort of what we're kind of getting here, I believe, from the results, which is interesting to think about for sure. But it's not something that I'm like overly surprised about. I just think that, Giratina is Giratina and it's going to be really good. And Oricorio as well is going to be really good. So expect to see a lot more Oricorio over the next couple weeks or so, whether that's in tournaments next weekend or it's on the ranked ladder. You're probably going to see a lot of Oricorio. So I would suspect either you should play Oricorio or counterplay it. And if not, just play either Giratina, Darkrai, or Charizard, Incineroar and hope that you don't go up against Oricorio. That's kind of it. That's literally, I think, what this kind of format, at least right now, boils down to. However, you're going to want to stay tuned because in tomorrow's tier list, we're going to go in depth and talk about where all of these decks really fit on a tier list, and which decks I believe are kind of the best decks to be playing right now and the most well-positioned decks. But anyway, guys, that's the first meta report of the Celestial Guardians format. We probably have 3 more tournaments, 3 or 4 more weekends of data to view here. I think things are going to change a lot. I think that the meta shares for next week are going to look entirely different, which means the results of next week's tournament are probably going to be entirely different as well. So keep that in mind. Hopefully this video was interesting to you guys, and hopefully you guys stick around and stay tuned because we got a lot of stuff to cover here on the channel. Like I said, tier list coming tomorrow, so stay tuned for that. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you guys so much for watching. Comment below what you thought of this tournament. What do you thought of the decks? What do you thought of the results and everything about this current metagame? I would love to hear your guys' opinions. Either way, I think that what we're in right now is a pretty diverse format. I think that there's a lot of strong decks, and actually my significant belief is that Oricorio is actually really healthy for the game. from like a diversity standpoint. Because like I said, it kind of creates, before we really only had like two sides of the coin. You had like decks that were really strong, and then you had the decks that countered the really strong decks. But what Oricorio does is it kind of slices it another kind of way where, again, Oricorio is really good against some decks are good against Oricorio, but then some decks are good against the decks that are good against Oricorio. So it splits things like three ways, three different buckets, and there's going to be a couple of decks in each of those buckets that are relevant. So instead of having maybe 2 or 3 decks at the top of the metagame right now, what we're going to have now is probably 5 or 6 decks that are all kind of at the top of the metagame, which I think is definitely really, really important, and I think it's going to be good for the diversity of the game. And hopefully you guys find something that fits your playstyle and is something that you enjoy playing. So anyway, guys, that's the video. Hopefully this helped, and hopefully it was interesting to you guys. Again, don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll see you guys later. Peace out. Have a good one. We'll see you guys tomorrow. And yeah, bye.